Joining us from Boston is Kaveh Afrasiabi. He's a political scientist and the author of several books on Iran, Islam and the Middle East. John Sitilides is a global risk analyst with Trilogy Advisors here in Washington, D.C. And with us from New York is France 24 correspondent Emmanuel Saint-Martin. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let me start with Emmanuel in New York. And Emmanuel, there was a news conference held earlier today with President Trump and President Macron. And during that news conference, President Macron talked about a new Iran deal. And just to be clear, he's not talking about scrapping the existing deal or withdrawing from it like President Trump wants to. He's talking about an addition to the existing deal. But in a sense, is he beginning to sound more like Donald Trump when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal? Because the initial point of his coming here was to persuade the president to stick with the current deal.
Well, he has been saying that for a long time. When he met Donald Trump in New York here for the UN General Assembly, they talked about the same thing and the same subject, and he had the same, basically, he was saying the same thing, Emmanuel Macron. He was saying that that deal must stay, and we must add another one because this first deal is not perfect, and we must address questions like ballistic missiles, which is, of course, a big concern for Donald Trump. He addressed that in his speech and a press conference at the White House. So that hasn't changed for Emmanuel Macron. His idea is that he can try to convince Donald Trump that to stay in that deal, in that first deal, by promising there will be another one. Of course, it's only a promise because that's not going to happen before May 12th, that's for sure. Can the Iranians agree to another deal? That's an entire different question. Can Russia, China, for example, support another deal? That's also an entirely different question. So what Macron is asking from Trump is kind of a leap of faith into him, into his leadership, into Macron's leadership, and he tells him, be with me, stuck with me, and stick with me, and then we can hope for another agreement, another accord. Of course, that's a big bet. That would be a big bet for Donald Trump, given what he said about this first treaty.
Okay, let's go to Kaveh Afrasiabi. And Kaveh Afrasiabi, here we have two countries, both signatories to the Iran nuclear deal. Both countries now saying, well, we're not happy with the deal as it stands right now. Donald Trump has called it a disaster. He wants to withdraw from the deal. And Emmanuel Macron, the French president, is now saying, well, we need to add something onto it to make it better. In a sense, are these two countries actually shifting the goalposts here?
Well, we knew about President Trump for quite some time, but I was terribly disappointed in Macron's very poor performance today, making a self-reversal and appeasing Trump and sounding like him on the Iran nuclear issue and invoking this no idea of a new nuclear deal, whereas just a couple of days ago he was telling the media that there's no plan B, and denying that he ever said that about the Iran deal, claiming that that was about the climate change. So I think that Mr. Macron did quite a number on his own prestige and credibility as an independent European leader, and it was quite dwarfed in the course of the press conference today. I really think that the international community is by and large convinced of the goodness of this agreement. China and Russia have drafted a statement asking the other world leaders to urge President Trump to stay with the nuclear deal, that it's in the interest of the international community. So these two leaders have basically isolated themselves from the rest of the world, and it will backfire on them, certainly on Mr. Macron when he returns to Europe.
Okay, well, let's talk to John right here in the studio. John, what's your reading of what you're hearing from President Emmanuel Macron and President Trump?
It's very difficult today to ascertain what exactly will be taking place in about 3 weeks' time, but President Trump has made very clear there were some of the more onerous provisions of the deal. And maybe we should emphasize there really are no signatories to this. There's no agreement. There's no formal treaty. It's not even legally binding on the United States. That's what the Obama administration said at the time. So there's just a political commitment from one administration to the other to see through the terms of the deal. But the spot inspections are very critical for the United States. Right now, there are no spot inspections. So if the IAEA intends to inspect...
The inspectors have said that Iran is complying with the deal.
We have a hard time believing that the Iranians are ready for the kind of spot inspections that the U.S. wants for verification that they're abiding by the terms of the deal. I think also there's great concern, as the president said before, with the ballistic missile development. That's of great concern in terms of Iran's general aggressive activities in the region. And I don't know that there's, quote-unquote, unanimity in the international community besides the U.S. and France. Many of Iran's Sunni neighbors are very much concerned.
Okay, on that point, John, the Iranian Foreign Minister has been talking about that very issue. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Yes.
Everybody has advised the administration that this is not a bilateral agreement between Iran and the United States. And withdrawing from it would be seen by the international community as an indication that the United States is not a reliable partner. Iran has many options, and those options are not pleasant. Those options are ready, including options that would involve resuming at a much greater speed.
Just on the point of the other signatories to this deal, does the Iranian Foreign Minister have a point there? I mean, it's not just the United States and France that signed the deal. There are other countries. There's Russia, there's China.
I don't think there's much concern in the White House for what the Iranian government thinks about U.S. actions to either add provisions to toughen the deal or to withdraw from the deal completely. I just don't think it's a major issue here. We will be paying very close attention to the concerns of the French, as we are with Mr. Macron here, with Chancellor Merkel later this week, and with the British. And the Russians and the Chinese we're in discussions with, but they may have very different interests in the United States and the West in terms of how Iran plays out its larger hegemonic designs in the Middle East. And I think there's one more issue to keep in mind here, Anand. This is not taking place in a vacuum of how we're dealing with Iran. The president is planning on meeting with Kim Jong-un the middle of May. And I think in many ways, the way the U.S. deals with Iran is going to be signaling to North Korea what they can expect if there's some type of a deal with the North Korean regime on denuclearization or their missile development. And if one administration can sign on to a deal and the next one walks away from it 3 years later, to what extent is Kim Jong-un going to be convinced that any deal he might do with Donald Trump will survive the next administration? So it's not just happening with Iran. It's also looking at North Korea.
Nathan, let me go to you on that issue. Earlier today, the Iranian Foreign Minister, Javad Zarif, whom we just heard, he also talked to the American radio network NPR and said that if Washington insists on going back on the deal, then nobody will be prepared to compromise with the United States in future. And, you know, as we understand it, the world of diplomacy and international relations works on understanding that if one administration signs a deal, then the following administration respects that deal. Is that now not the case?
Well, I mean, Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif on NPR, I heard the interview this morning. He knows his talking points very well. And as our previous guest said, you know, he also knows that there's a meeting coming up in the DPRK, with the DPRK over a nuclear deal there. And, you know, the last thing, for example, the DPRK wants to do is go down the road of, say, Libya, where they agreed to give up their nuclear program, and then, you know, a few years later, Colonel Gaddafi's killed on the streets. The North Koreans are very well aware of this. The Iranians are very well aware of this. What they are saying is essentially, look, United States, this nuclear deal benefits everyone, including you, because by signing it, what you actually did was move the nuclear problem away from the greater Middle East for at least until 2025. And that doesn't just mean Iran. It means Israel. It means Saudi Arabia. And OK, you may have criticism about Iranian foreign policy in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, elsewhere. But there are others who have criticism about Saudi Arabian foreign policy in these same areas as well. But what you've done is move the threat of some sort of nuclear arms race in the Middle East away. That was one of the sole reasons of the deal, and also to stop an attack by Israel or others, or including the US, on enrichment facilities. So basically Macron's message and the Europeans' message is, if you basically get rid of this deal, you could kick over or create a hornet's nest that you don't need to do now. Let's focus on the problems, other problems we can fix.
Emmanuel, are we seeing here what diplomats sometimes called linkage? Because during that news conference, President Macron said that any new deal would also involve three other elements, three new elements. Let's listen to what he had to say.
for me, the key pillars of this new approach we want to adopt. And it's exactly what President Trump said. We have nuclear on the short run. We have nuclear on the long run. We have ballistic activity. We have regional presence of Iran. We want to fix the situation for these 4 pillars. Syria is part of the 4th one.
Kaveh Afrasiabi, listening there to President Macron, is he saying now, essentially, that we've got to fulfill all these other things, these new elements as well, for that Iran nuclear deal to be valid?
Well, it's pretty self-delusional. And if I may address what your guest in Washington, D.C. said, the Iran nuclear agreement, and I've discussed this at length in a couple of books, is an international agreement embodied and embraced by the United Nations. And you have 500 European parliamentarians just recently signing a letter, sending it to the US Congress, urging the US to stick with its obligations under the nuclear agreement. And to say that it's not signed, it's just a political agreement and so forth, is just a bunch of apologetic nonsense. Let's call a spade a spade. Iran has fulfilled its obligations. There are 11 IAEA reports confirming that, and there's absolutely not a shred of evidence to corroborate Trump administration's cry about Iran's non-compliance, etc. So if the Trump administration exits the deal, Iran will take reciprocal action, and we've heard from the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council that even exiting the NPT is now an option that they are seriously considering.
What's your response to that, John? And aren't there legal obligations on either side? For instance, if the inspectors report that Iran is not in compliance with this agreement, then the deal doesn't exist anymore.
The Obama administration wrote a letter to the U.S. Senate stating that it is no legally binding force to the deal. It is a deal. It is not an agreement. It is not a treaty. And it's unfortunate that our colleague here doesn't appreciate those facts, but those are the facts, and they're quite stubborn. This is an administration decision. It's not going to be the U.S. Congress. And maybe in hindsight, that was President Obama's error. He never submitted this for Senate ratification. And so it has no binding authority, at least under U.S. law. It was endorsed by the United Nations Security Council. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of U.S. law, it has the force that the president decides to put behind it.
Nathan, President Macron came here with the intention of persuading Donald Trump to stay with this agreement. That's what we were told before he came here, because he was, that was the intention. But when you look at what happened now, when you look at the news conference that we heard, when you look at the kind of modifications that President Macron's talking about, was he effectively played by Donald Trump here?
Well, I mean, there's this Icarus problem with the US president, isn't there? If you fly too close to the sun, your wings melt and you drop to the ground. I mean, we've seen that today with Emmanuel Macron. We saw it last week at Mar-a-Lago with Shinzo Abe at the press conference, where basically the president turned around and said, I'm not giving you immunity from the steel and aluminum tariffs. Our trade deficit's too big. And then he spent the rest of the press conference praising Xi Jinping, of course, who's a regional rival of Shinzo Abe. So, this was not good for allies. This is not good when allies try and get very close to the president. He can turn around and burn them. Having said that, Emmanuel Macron has known for months at what US President Donald Trump has been saying about the Iran deal. The problem is that there have been behind-the-scenes negotiations on what could save it, and the Europeans will not move to where Donald Trump wants them to go. And so Macron is trying to do this sort of dance where he's talking about these 4 pillars, the JCPOA being one of them, but the 4th pillar on Syria, for example, saying, look, we need a Syrian peace deal, we need the American troops to stay, that will curtail Iranian behavior, stop it accessing the Mediterranean. Right. Mr. President, think of it in long-term ways to try and stop that decision being made on May 12th. And given the rhetoric here that we've seen over the last 12 to 24 hours, that doesn't seem to have set in yet. Now, it's Donald Trump, remember. He could change his mind in 5 minutes. Right. He gave an indication at the end of the press conference that he would consider it. But he also kind of winked at everyone and said, you kind of know what I'm going to do.
John?
Well, I think Mr. Macron can claim a partial victory on the Syria discussions. The president has been stating repeatedly recently that he wants to completely disengage, remove all troops from Syria, and have them return back home. And President Macron was able to, it seems, persuade the president to seriously consider the quote-unquote third way. Don't disengage completely. Make sure that we don't have a humanitarian catastrophe in Syria, that Iran does not become the hegemon inside of Syria, and that you leave a space in the eastern part of the country for radical Sunni Islamists to come back, as they did with the Islamic State several years ago. So it seems the president is not going to maintain any type of a heavy presence in the eastern part of the country. He won't fully disengage, and I think Macron can at least take a feather in his cap on that one.
Okay. Emmanuel, looking at these other three conditions that President Macron came up with, I mean, one of those conditions is the fact that attempts be made to limit Iran's influence in the Middle East. And I'm wondering how one goes about that. And when you hear something like that, isn't this in effect being set up for failure? You know, how do you fulfill something like limit your influence in a particular region of the planet?
Yeah, that's obviously one of the difficulties with what Macron is trying to do, because it's a much more complicated issues, I would say, than even the nuclear issue in itself, because it's much larger problems with the region and several countries in the region being involved. So it's more of a long-term discussion that he's trying to have, even if he's talking about another agreement, a second agreement, but he's trying to also reassure maybe Trump by trying to take those issues head on, but that's for sure that there is no short-term solution there. That's a problem that have been that the region has known for decades. So he knows that. But what I think he's trying to do is not saying we're going to have another agreement in 2 weeks, in a month.
Right.
He's trying to pull together and keep together the coalition that was put together for this agreement, for the first one against the Iranian nuclear armament.
Okay.
And he's saying by trying to do that, he wants to put together, to keep together Chinese, Russians, the Europeans, the Americans, and that's what his long-term view is. At least that's what his advisors are saying right now.
Okay.
Trying to take the long view here on these issues.
Emmanuel, let me ask you this very quickly, if you could, please. How big a political issue is this for President Macron back in France? I mean, when he gets back to France, he's going to be criticized because he did not get a firm assurance from President Trump that the United States is going to stay with this deal, or he didn't get any kind of assurance that this deal could be in any kind of jeopardy.
I doubt it. I'm not sure it's going to be such big an issue. You know, there is a lot of things going on the economic front with strikes in France and a lot of things going on. So I think French people are more focused on that. And what they're going to look at they're going to look at the international stature of Macron. And even if he doesn't win this particular bet on Trump changing his mind, I don't think a lot of people are going to be telling him that it's his fault. You know, who is in Donald Trump's head and who can really know what he's going to say. So that's more, you know, more a question of stature, international stature, trying to lead Europe. Is going to come, and after him, Merkel is going to be here, trying the same thing, repeating basically the same thing. So it's more about him showing that he leads Europe than really winning these short-term bets on Trump changing his mind, I think.
Okay, Kaveh Afrasiabi, one of the complaints from the Iranians is that they're keeping to their side of the deal. They're complying with the agreement, but they say the United States is not complying with the agreement because it's been dissuading European companies and European corporations from doing business with Iran by threatening them with consequences for that. It might not be the letter of the deal, but it's the spirit of the deal. Do the Iranians have a point there when they say, look, you know, part of this deal was that business comes back to us, that these sanctions be lifted?
It's actually a violation of the letter of the deal itself, because it clearly states that the parties should do whatever to enhance Iran's trade after the implementation phase of the agreement begins. And President Trump, as we know, has been trying very hard, lobbying the European and other leaders to dissuade them from engaging in trade and commercial relations with Iran. And Iran has raised that complaint in the internal dispute resolution mechanism of the JCPOA, the Joint Commission, to no avail, and has sent letters of complaint to the United Nations. And Iran, is very unhappy because the initial enthusiasm for open trade with the Europeans and so forth has pretty much dried up due to the U.S. intransigence. And if this continues, there is no benefit, economic benefit from the JCPOA. Iran will exit from the deal regardless of the U.S.'s bullying. And we have seen that in the past, and it's going to invite disaster in the region. It's not going to bring any benefit to the United States and to President Trump's presidency. And it's a very wrong road to take. And I'm very sad to hear Mr. Macron acting as Trump whisperer.
Okay. We've got about a minute left. And John, I'm going to go to you and to Nathan. So let's keep this short. What are your feelings on the future of the deal?
Boy, that's a really tough one. I think that somehow the president is not going to score a 100% commitment to his campaign pledge and completely withdraw. I think there will be some additional conditions. The U.S. will find a way to have the Europeans try to negotiate with the Iranians. And he's also going to be able to point to the Congress. Many Republicans in the Senate and in the House are against this deal, and many Americans are against the deal. This is not simply about President Trump. He's also reflecting the will of many, many Americans.
Right. Nathan, next month, an important time for this agreement. Next month, that's when the U.S. president has to certify that Iran is in compliance with the deal. Of course, this is not part of the international deal. This is purely a domestic requirement. What do you see happening?
I'm not so confident as our last guest. I think he's going to pull out. He kicked it to Congress last time. They didn't do anything. He's been telling everyone in more and more aggressive language that he's probably going to pull out. Remember, he also wants to take a slightly more aggressive, and I don't necessarily mean military stand, but I mean aggressive foreign policy against Iran in the region. You wouldn't have John Bolton as the new national security advisor or Mike Pompeo coming in if that wasn't the case. And I think pulling out of that deal will be able to make them reframe U.S. foreign policy to Iran.
All right, that's where we have to leave it. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.